Start webinar. Do, 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 do. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our CX and Digital Empathy webinar. We are so excited you're here. Thanks for jumping in. If you're joining us from somewhere interesting or just that you think is interesting, let us know in the chat window. I'm currently in Austin, Texas, and I'm Crystal Weiss, the Director of Marketing at Question Pro. Ken, who is one of our presenters, is based out of Hawaii. And Jonathan, who's coming to us with all of his great knowledge on digital empathy, is based in the UK. So we would love to know where you're from and let us know in the chat window. And if you have any questions during the panel or, at all, you can drop those into the Q&A window, and you can also vote up and down on other people's questions that you find interesting. And we will be doing a live Q&A with those questions at the end of the session. India, that's great. A lot of our team's in India. Who else is joining? Sagar, I know you're from India. I see you in the attendee window. This is, John, I see you. I don't know if I know where you live. And we're just Switzerland, so fun. That's great, man. I've never been to Switzerland. Have you guys? Jonathan, you're probably the closest.
Oh yeah.
I've been there a few times.
And I love it. Yeah.
Chicago. Oh, go Cubs. I mean, unless you're a White Sox fan. Is that right? Yeah, I was gonna say the Mets, but that's the wrong city. This is great, guys. So glad you were able to join us. We're gonna start in about 3 minutes, so thanks for jumping on a little early with us. We also have some other stuff happening at Question Pro. If you didn't know, we do about 3 live shows a week. Ken, you do CX forums every Wednesday, correct?
Correct.
And I'm going to drop some of those links into the chat window. We also do Live with Dan every Friday, which Jonathan was a guest on last Friday. And I'm sure he had a great time.
It's well worth a look. Yeah.
And we also do a Clubhouse room every Wednesday. So if you need an invite to that, let us know. An MRX club, and then you can host rooms within that club. And we do a Work at Life podcast that goes live every other Tuesday. We're there on season 2, talking about the first female recession this season. So we always have lots of content that you guys can join us on, along with our webinars that are kind of more strategic around interesting topics, like we're doing today with CX and digital empathy. So let's see if there are some more people joining. Please let us know where you're from in the chat window. We always love to know where you're joining us from, as we are all based all over the world as well. And when we get going, please make sure that you use the Q&A window to ask your questions to these esteemed panelists, because they will be answering them at the end of the hour. Don't make a face when I say esteemed, Jonathan.
I rarely get called that, Crystal. I'm just enjoying it.
So it looks like we're starting to level up. Oh, nope, some new people joining. This is great. We're so excited you're here. I'm Crystal Weiss. I'm the Director of Marketing at Question Pro, and we are always creating great content experiences for you. But if you have some suggestions, let us know. We are always looking to do some live events, because we know that they bring authenticity and value to you as our customers or future customers, or just friends of Question Pro. So let us know what you might like some content on. And let us know where you're from in the chat window. Make sure you put your questions in the Q&A window, and we will be answering those at the end of the hour. If you have to leave early, or if you know someone who couldn't make it, don't worry. We'll be sending out a recording and the Q&A in a couple days after the webinar, with a landing page where you can find the video, transcript, Q&A, and everything you're going to need in case you have to jump out early. We know that an hour of your time is sometimes a lot to ask, so we just thank you for that. Ooh, Fiji, that's fun.
And my neighbor.
Yeah, I think that might even trump you, Ken. I don't know.
Most remote, yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Hey, well, you know what, guys? I'm going to jump out of here and let you guys get started. We are so excited that you're here to talk to us about CX and digital empathy.
Thank you, Crystal.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Jonathan, for joining. I'm looking forward to this conversation. First, just quick intros. I'll introduce myself. Kenneth Peterson. I actually run the CX group here at Question Pro. Got about we'll call it a 20-year plus history. We'll just stop there. I don't need to age myself that much. I've been in and out of all different sort of aspects of customer experience and the market research side, but my background actually comes from operations, where it was just all about the numbers driving operational efficiency and results. So I stand on sort of one side of this boxing ring, and I think Jonathan's more on the other side, the human element. So I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. So my name's Jonathan Hawkins. I'm CEO of Anthrolytics. We're a relatively new company, but I think like you, Ken, I kind of stop at the 20-year marker because it doesn't serve me well to go much further back than that. But I've always been very much on the software side of the house and customer experience, initially in contact centers, and then latterly for companies like Sapmetrics, really working on the sort of data collection NPS side of the house. So awful lot of experience on that side. And primarily my roles, rather than being operational, have been far more in the sort of customer relationship side. So everything from sort of sales through account management, customer success, consulting, and so on and so forth. So really the sort of customer facing side of the house is my biggest area of expertise operationally.
Yeah, and I think that's what's going to make this conversation a lot of fun, because we bring two very different views. And now, granted, in my 20+ years, I've softened, but I mean, we're really looking to answer this, one question: how do you treat customers empathetically at scale? And it's a challenge. When I think when we first started planning this discussion, someone said, "We've been doing the easy stuff for years." I believe that was you.
Yes. I think possibly that was me being a little bit confrontational about it, but I think we have. Look, I mean, I think you think about CX as a discipline broadly. It's 20 odd years old, right? I mean, it's been called different names, but broadly it's sort of 20+ years old. And I think we've done a lot of the easy stuff. We've gone through market research into sort of mass surveys with people. There's been some great work done around the analytics. You think about the sort of outcome side of it around sort of churn modeling and segmentation. Certainly an awful lot of advances, but I think it's time for something a little newer. And the reason I say that is not obviously just because I have a vested interest in it, but part of the reason we set this company up was because consumers have changed, right? I mean, and the world has changed, as we all know. But I do think that the change in consumer thinking was happening prior to COVID, prior to a lot of the sort of social events that we saw, right? I think it accelerated it, undoubtedly. But what you've seen is consumers really starting to move from having the primary buying criteria based on sort of price and convenience, really. And now they're starting to think more broadly around, well, actually, is this a type of company I want to do business with? Does this company and the management seem to look after its ecosystem of stakeholders? And I think a lot of the research that you're seeing is around loyalty and the biggest drivers of loyalty nowadays, and consumers are putting empathy right at the top of that. And and honestly, I don't think a lot of CX programs, I don't think a lot of organizations, either from an employee side or a customer side, are set up or mature enough to be able to think about, back to your question, how do we do this at scale? Because it's really hard, right? People think of empathy as the one-to-one conversation. I understand you and I empathize, perhaps in a retail environment is the classic example, or a contact center. The question then comes, well, how do you do this for all the customers who aren't contacting you, all the people you're not meeting face to face? And that's a very, very significant challenge that we'll sort of dive into during the course of this conversation. But that's why I think it's very relevant to the market today, and why Yeah, CX needs to move on quite dramatically and quite quickly, because I think it's lagging in some way behind where the consumers are.
And it definitely is. And you brought up a point that near and dear to my heart, because I do remember about my first 10 years in the business, it was all about efficient delivery of surveys.
Correct.
And delivery of surveys is not empathy. Listening is not empathy. Empathy is responding. And then we had to shift to, I'll call it closed loop feedback. I mean, there's a lot of names that are out in the industry, and that, everyone says, see, we're listening to the customer and responding, but you're listening and responding. You're not listening and responding empathetically. And I always like to use the one example. I was a frequent renter of rental cars, same station every week, same airport. I had a complaint once. I filled out the survey. I got a response back that looked pretty automated to me, and in fact had a spelling error. And it just offered me a $25 coupon. That is not an empathetic response, but I figured I'd test it and see what happens. And every week I went back and gave the same negative response about my one complaint that I wanted someone to listen to. And every week I got the same email with the same $25 coupon with the same spelling error. So I just knew it was automated and it wasn't empathetic.
Yeah, and the crazy thing is, Ken, that's what's happening today. That example from 10 years ago is still happening today. And of course, the curious thing is that, we did some research last year, and even if you can't resolve a customer problem, in the event of a complaint, you can't resolve it, the loyalty scores, if you deal with that person empathetically, whilst saying you can't solve the problem, are still actually far higher than the example you gave, right? And actually higher than a perfectly normal transaction, right? Because you feel as though you've been listened to. And I think that's the really important thing. So yeah, but it's certainly very interesting. And I think that and of course this has been exacerbated by the pandemic, because we've been pushing customers down digital channels, obviously, because we had to. There was no option around that. And I think a lot of organizations still think of operational efficiency as a competitive differentiator. And in many markets, certainly as consumers, the commoditized markets of, say, telco, banking, so on and so forth, that we all deal in, well, they're all pretty much on a par, right? I mean, it's very few and far between that you actually get a service that wows you. And so I think a lot of companies are still focused on operational efficiency, whilst consumers are thinking of that as a hygiene factor. They just expect the deliveries to be there in 24 hours. They expect you to answer the phone for your mobile network to work. And so, there's a ton of money being pushed into that operational side of the business, whereas actually the bigger gains to be had are being pushed, or should be pushed, into understanding your customers. And dealing with them empathetically. And I think the challenge, Ken, is always that every decision has an emotional component to it. It's not to say that every decision is emotional, but I think widely accepted that there is an emotional component to every decision. And so given that, why wouldn't we try and understand the emotions of all of our customers? Because there's a lot of tech out there today which will do it at the point of interaction, right? Somebody sends a survey response in, you can pick it up from verbatim. Somebody calls into a call center, you can do it real time. But that still leaves probably 95+% of your customers. You have no idea on their emotional state. And therefore, how are you going to deal with these people empathetically unless you can start scaling out that emotional prediction and emotional scoring on all of the customers?
Exactly. And I mean, you alluded to this before. But why is it so important in this current environment? Let's face it. You said we're getting pushed down different channels, but it's also, what you said, we compete on it. So, competing on it is huge because I've seen companies that, you mentioned we're going to, make this process more efficient for you. I always love the grocery store examples here in the US where they're pushing you to self-checkout. Which has its perks.
Yeah, far more efficient for you, Ken. But you don't really have a relationship, do you?
and yeah, as an operations person, I appreciate how instead of 6 cashiers, we have 1 cashier managing 6 checkout lines, reducing the queue. But it definitely goes right to what you just said, is you have no idea how any of these people feel. You don't have, I mean, you don't even have that interaction at that point, let alone name, how to contact them. I mean, if you've just completely disconnected it. And then if you go steps further now, I mean, you have restaurants delivering to customers that have never, they don't even know the name of the customer. All they know is a delivery driver is going to come pick it up and deliver it to that customer. And so how do we get there, and how does that change the consumer expectations of that business?
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, and I think that, and I think you're right with all of those examples. You know, I mean, I use the phrase a lot. You know, we've engineered out the relationship with the customer, and then we wonder why, in a highly commoditized environment, churn goes through the roof. Because actually, if we think of operations as a hygiene factor, we understand that we've engineered out the relationship. Then all of a sudden, well, of course I'm going to change. If somebody offers me $10 a month less on my mobile plan, well, why wouldn't I move? And I think the other thing that causes a great deal of frustration in this environment around not understanding your customers is, yeah, all the marketing blasts, right? I mean, and we all get them. And
Mhm.
I don't know about anyone on this call, but I'm kind of suspecting that 99% of the time we delete them. And the reason we delete them is they're not relevant. I mean, it's almost back to the point you made about the $25 voucher, right?
Mhm.
It's almost a bit of an insult, right? You're not understanding me. So, you know, one of the things we work very hard with our clients to do is really ensure that by putting this emotional scoring in place, that they're able to start to run empathetic marketing campaigns. So as an example, if I know that, you know, you and I are in the same segment, and we know that Ken actually has had some great experiences, is very receptive to us to buying some more, then let's go market to Ken and try and upsell him. If, on the other hand, I'm one of the vast majority of ambivalent customers that never opens marketing, well, actually, why don't I now try and build Jonathan's loyalty? And we've seen this in action for a retail bank, where, I mean, the results they saw, I mean, frankly, took us by surprise. You know, whilst we obviously believe we do great work, we weren't really expecting the results that we saw. But what they did was they took our emotional scoring across their customer base and added that into their segmentation. And so what they did was said, right, okay, I'm only going to market to those customers which we predict are receptive. And then for those customers who are ambivalent, actually what we're going to do is put a loyalty campaign in place. And they saw two things happen there. One was a significant increase in revenue from the marketing campaigns, obviously, because, as you know, I mean, I've run sales teams for years, right? And you're always trying to say, right, yeah, you use the rifle shot, don't use the scattergun. And so you're starting to get a lot more sort of, you know, close line of sight on your target audience who are going to buy. But then secondarily, they were able to run loyalty campaigns into those customers who were relatively ambivalent and start making them far more economically active because they felt as though they were being listened to. There was an understanding that, look, you're a bank. Honestly, how emotionally connected am I going to be to you? But actually, I'm now seeing different ways that you can provide value to me. And this was particularly prevalent in the younger groups of customers. And what they saw over a period of time was that churn in that group actually went down 11% over and above their standard churn rate, which was, you know, a spectacular result. But for those people who also stayed, they started to become economically more active. They stayed longer over a period of years. They became economically more active. And so customer lifetime value increased. You know, I don't have the end figures for it, but, you know, increased substantially over a period of time. So, you know, it's fascinating the results that they were getting from, you know, really, we will say, you know, we're combining behavioral science with data science. And I think when you start doing that and applying it, it becomes, yeah, it becomes very, very powerful, because I think it always takes people by surprise. They're kind of, oh, you're not just trying to force something down my throat. You actually understand me, even though I'm one of 60 million
Exactly.
customers. And that's the key thing.
And I've worked on that same side with sports clubs who have
Yeah.
no idea who their customers are. All they know is, you know, where you purchase your seats. Now, where you purchase your seats is a pretty good indicator of two things: either your loyalty to the club or how much money you have to spend on seats.
Mhm.
If you're sitting in the nosebleeds, you're probably a little more casual or just don't have the money to invest. And yet this one particular club was sending out the same standard marketing email, And I'll refrain from naming the brands, but it starts with their sponsor name. Premium Car Company A welcomes you to the newsletter. Read our newsletter. And I kept receiving that and looking at it. I'm like, you're not hitting your audience, because about 70% of them will never purchase that vehicle. And it was the same idea. It's like, if you just took a few moments to think about, you have other vehicle sponsors, and take economy car B and put that in the headline, and such a vast improvement on just click rates. And Harzit put something in chat that said, where can we best use this for retail outlets and optimize the CX? And I mean, those are examples of where it happens. I mean, if you don't, I call them the unnamed customer. You just sort of know maybe what they buy, when they're buying, things like that. You can really think about what their needs are. If you have someone coming into a branch, I'm probably the exception to the rule, but if you have someone that's coming into a branch at 11 p.m. shopping right before the retail location closes, chances are it's because of their work schedule. They're working late, things like that. And so you have to put yourself in their shoes a little bit and try to understand, like, what are their needs at that time? And chances are their needs are get the things they need and get out of there. They're tired.
How do I execute this as quickly as possible to get home and get some sleep? And it's interesting because we actually had a call with a retailer this morning discussing exactly this point. And I think, obviously, look, retailers nowadays, look, depending on the retailer, but they typically do have quite a lot of information in terms of loyalty schemes and what have you. So, I think, we were actually quite taken aback with the level of data that we were able to get a hold of in terms of starting to run these predictions across the customer base. But I think primary use case there really is, I mean, there's marketing, which we talked about previously. Like, how do I ensure that when the example they gave me was, Jonathan, how do I get people to buy more beans, right? And actually the answer to that is, well, there are certain things I can't help with, right? I mean, exactly. Emotion and beans don't necessarily go together greatly, but what I can tell you is who's going to be most receptive to buying at that particular time versus who's likely to, is very angry and wants to leave versus who's ambivalent and you need to big up the brand. So, but the primary use case there really was service operations, right? It's how do we optimize our operation to now we understand the emotional link between events, i.e. experiences that people are having as they go through the customer journey with us, as they enter the store, traverse it. Now, so if we now understand that, and we can link emotions to events or experiences, now all of a sudden we can start to say, okay, now if we're starting to think about service design, experience design, how do we use emotion to drive the right behaviors? And those right behaviors are, buying more, staying with us for longer, improving customer lifetime value. So in terms of retail, I think, look, there's a marketing play there, undoubtedly, if you're thinking about loyalty schemes, but then there's an experience design and service ops design as well, is how you would apply it in the real world.
Yeah, and that's so true. I mean, you have to bring empathy to operations design. And I always joke, before I got into market research, I was an operations lead for a retailer. My role involved.
You're better qualified to answer that question than I was, Ken. You should have dived in.
Well, no, I mean, it's exactly how I would have answered it. My role was just numbers. It was, how do we staff based on the forecast I have for sales? And how do I make sure that, the logistics of the trucks are getting to each location best possible time for me, for the warehouse, and for the drivers, as opposed to when is the best possible time, say, for the customers. Yeah. So it's, it became one of those, it was always a very solid decision based on numbers only. There's no emotion. And I remember, I frequently joke about it because I get these market research reports, again, aging myself a little bit. They were, 5-inch thick binders of cross tabulations. And I would get that, and I think I looked through it pretty thoroughly the first time and said, yeah, this doesn't mean much to me. And we'd get them once a quarter, and I'd put them up on a little shelf. And anytime someone would come in and say, have you seen the latest market research numbers? I'd point to the binder and say, well, there they are.
Yeah.
And so there was no emotion involved in what I was doing. But the reality is there should have been. There should have been thinking about the emotion, and I should have been connecting it. And so when I jumped into CX and I started to see the emotion, I really saw how it became much more important to be able to think about those operational efficiencies. And if we go back to that self-checkout example, it's great that you are speeding things up and make it easier for people that want to get out of there. But man, are you missing out on an opportunity to connect with your customers
and that's
at a
really
larger
the big
scale?
question, and they're the kind of questions, because look, the reality is you might find, once you've done this type of analysis, that actually 50% of your customers love the self-serve, right? And actually it does drive loyalty in them, because you take your example of the person going in at 11 o'clock at night. They probably don't really want to interact with anyone. They've just done a long shift. It's the last thing they want to do is start having a chat with somebody very cheerful on the checkout. So it's not that operational efficiency is bad. The question is, how do you ensure you're doing the right things to drive the right emotions, which subsequently drive the right behaviors and outcomes? And I think it starts to become very clean in terms of that measurement, from experience through to emotion, through to behavior, through to financial linkage. And I think that starts to become very interesting when you start applying emotions for it. And I didn't actually read the question, but I saw something come up for around mentioning NPS on the chat. But a lot of the CX measures, from NPS, customer effort, the typical ones, they're pretty hard to start linking through. Intuitively, of course, we know that they're right, and there is a financial linkage, but the number of consulting projects that I've been involved in, and my consultants have been involved in, trying to make that financial linkage at previous companies, and it's tough, right? There's always a little bit of sort of torturing the data to try and prove the linkage somewhere, and I think that
I always called it teasing the data, not torturing the data.
Teasing is well, I call it torturing, but maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm more cynical than you are, Ken. I don't know. But and people wonder why when they walk into their exec's office to ask for more budget, they don't necessarily get the buy-in they expect. So that's but that's a whole different webinar.
Yeah. Well, but it does speak to, I mean, when we take it out of sort of that consumer level, when you start talking to B2B, that there's that same thing. What resonates with me, and I'll even say, being, I am not in sales, but we're all in sales, and so when we start talking to our customers, it's really about, how do I make your life better? And I mean, if all of us as professionals thought of it that way, it really resonates. But oftentimes we get caught in the trap of, oh, well, we've got to respond to a question on the data, we got to respond to this, and then suddenly we start seeing things like I was at the forefront when NPS rolled out, and it's hey, one question, one open end. I mean, think about it. It's brilliant. You're getting the emotional side of that journey, and then you're just asking them to expand upon it. And back then, it was such a revolutionary idea, yet it didn't catch on the way it should have, mostly because of what we talk about in speech and text analytics, where we just had no way to read that at scale. And so a lot of companies said, oh, well, speech and text analytics, that will help me empathize with my customers. And where does that go wrong?
Yeah, and I think and I think you hit the nail on the head. Where it goes wrong is that you only have data on such a small subsection of your customers that it becomes incredible. I mean, it's like torture or tease the data, but you're extrapolating to the extremes, right? And you think about the typical data set that most CX programs have, and they have, look, from a relationship survey perspective, data once, maybe twice a year on, let's say, less than 10% of their customers. So it certainly has its place, and there's an awful lot you can do with it. But I think when you start using that. And I think this is the way that we tend to think about it, because of course, you know, we obviously need something upon which to build the models, right? We don't just stick our finger in the air and you know, guess that Ken's happy Ken. You know,
that's what I do, but
yeah. Well,
that's the wrong approach.
but I think the scientists in my company would get a little uppity with me if I used that as a methodology. Yeah, I think the years they spent getting their PhDs, you know, for me to walk in and go, oh, just have a good guess, guys, you'll be fine. Yeah, but
anywhere between 1 and 10, you're good.
Yeah, exactly. Anywhere's fine. Anywhere, just middle of the road. But you know, I think obviously you need, the same applies to any machine learning platform, right? You know, you need something upon which to calibrate the model. And what we need to calibrate the model are verbatims from customers, because we need to understand that emotional response to an event. And I mean, just looking at the question that's up here, like what do we think about measuring? We look at survey responses, typically contact center data, typically. So yeah, data that's coming from speech analytics, text analytics engines. And we use that to calibrate the model. So now we can say, okay, Ken experienced this event or sequence of events, and he had this emotional response to it. Then we can look at operational and transactional data and start linking that through to, well, okay, so now what did Ken go and do over the next 3-6 months? Okay, now you have a link directly from experience through to emotion through to behavior. And that, of course, because it's linked to a transaction, becomes very, very simple to start to link to financial outcomes, which is ultimately what we're all about. You know, where we don't do any projects where we don't think we can make that financial link, because it's, frankly, there's too many platforms in the market which don't make that link. And so we want to, we want to be the people that do. So I think from a data perspective, look, most companies have them. I think the only truth is that everyone's data is messy, right? Everyone's initial reaction is, well, our data is not going to be good enough to go and do this. You know, we haven't got this, we haven't got that. But I think the expectation is that you need perfect data to do this. And frankly, you don't. You know, no. All data is messy, all data's in different places, different formats, you know, so we're pretty expert at cleaning up that data. And also the truth is, look, if you're starting from zero, if your data's not that clean or that good, but I can give you a result that is 50% better than you've got, well, do you know what? That's still a massive improvement on where you are today. And as we move through the process, as more data comes in and the predictions get better, then of course, by definition, over the course of 12, 24, 36 months, everything becomes far, far more accurate. But I think there aren't really, for any company at scale, there aren't really many impediments to actually start doing this kind of stuff. Can you move rapidly from modeling through to full predictive? Absolutely. But the accuracy will of course vary depending on the input. But it's and I think that when you start building that into as I say, the CX operational models, how do we think about service design? How do we add it to segmentation? It's suddenly, I mean, it has a kind of double whammy effect. You have insights that can directly link experience through to an outcome. But secondarily, all that money you spent on CX platforms, on MarTech stacks, CDPs, by adding this data into it, it suddenly increases the ROI on those. So we very much see ourselves as the guys hate it when I call it this, but a back-end platform, right? We don't, I have no desire, and I'm sure nobody wants yet another system to log into, another dashboard to look at. And so our value really is taking data, transforming it, and pushing it back into systems of engagement and record to drive additional value from those platforms. So that's the way we tend to think about it. And then it also becomes far more operational. Right, because I can never build another Question Pro platform. I can never build another MarTech stack, a
lot of catching up if you do that.
Well, yeah, I'll be dropped off this call, right, if I do. But you know what I mean. You guys have got a great platform, all right, and you've spent huge amounts in R&D dollars developing it to the point it is today, which is great. And so, what's the benefit of me trying to replicate that and then plug my stuff into it? I'm far better saying, well, actually, I can plug into the back of all these other platforms that are experts in their field, and we're experts in our field, right? We do one thing and we do it really well. Yeah, that's how we think about measuring it at scale. And of course, you can now then run emotional and behavioral predictions on all of your customers every day, because once we have these models built, once we have a transactional data stream, we can start applying that scoring to every customer every day.
Yeah.
And then you can start grouping people into cohorts and so on and so forth. So it starts, and then look, we obviously have behavioral scientists on board who can help you do, what do you do with the data now you've got it. But frankly, a lot of companies at scale have behavioral science teams internally anyway. So, we're there to support if required, but, equally, if somebody wants to run it on their own, then more than happy to.
And I like your use of the word cohort. It all too often in marketing research, and customer experience, we talk about segments of customers, and it sounds very clinical. It sounds very operational. When you say cohort, they're grouped. They're a similar, like-minded individuals. And the other thing that really resonated with me there, we have we have our 10 commandments of Question Pro, and one of them is it's better to get 80% of the way there in 3 days than 100% of the way there in 3 weeks. And that's what you're saying, is just get started. And I think that's what a lot of people miss in the idea of, you don't have to have perfect data. Listen, 20 years ago, when I first jumped into this business, we were working with imperfect data, and we did so much more back then because people were like, hey, this is new, this is different. And then suddenly that data started getting closed off to other different groups because they all wanted to be that star. And you don't provide empathy to the customers in silos. I'll just say that much.
Agreed. And the reality is, Ken, look, you can start this with surveys with verbatims in it, right? I mean, and look, is it going to provide great value? Well, yeah, it'll provide significant value over and above what you're doing today, but there's a lot further you can go with it. But you can really start from the basics, That's so next question: where should you apply it? That's a really big question. Really big question.
It's a very tough one, and it starts at the top of the business, but it applies to everyone as far as I'm concerned. But there's some key areas where you can start talking that discussion.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It does start at the top, and it starts with an understanding of, and I think a lot of executives are very much in this point. That people understand that the world has changed. People understand that there is an emotional component to employees. I think that there's far more of a human understanding nowadays of that we need to treat people like human beings, employees, customers, shareholders, and so on and so forth, as we said earlier. In terms of where you apply this, I mean, I think the key one for me really is, if you're looking for the biggest bang for the buck, frankly, is marketing, right? Because, and I use marketing very broadly, because within marketing, I think about churn, I think about growth. So they're the two kind of component factors that marketing are generally involved in. How do I build campaigns that drive loyalty over the longer term? How do I build marketing campaigns to drive upsell within the customer base? And so, I think marketing is a key one. That's it's a very clean ROI from that point of view, because simply you can A/B test it, right? You can say, right, here's this cohort of customers, what did they do? There's another cohort where we didn't do this, what did they do? So it's it's pretty clean in terms of and we do this in pilots, right? I mean, it's we'll do 50% with the prediction, 50% without, and see the results. So I think marketing is very strong. I do put churn within that. You can argue, depending on the company, whether that's in sales, whether that's in customer success, whether that's in marketing. But ultimately, when you think about growth and churn, what we're trying to do is not replace segmentation models, not replace churn models, because Lord knows I'm never going to build a churn model as good as a telco that's been operating for 30 years and and could have spent tens of millions of dollars doing it. But again, back to that principle of adding value, what I can do is I can add another layer of great data into that. So that's what I call the sort of the growth and churn components, whether that be marketing or sales. Customer service, obviously, I think is a key one. I mean, now imagine a world whereby as somebody contacts you either through a contact center, a self-serve channel, that as they do that, routing can be applied based on the predicted emotional state of a customer. Okay, so Jonathan calls in, we think he's in a very happy emotional state. So actually, I'm going to push Jonathan to self-serve. Ken, we've predicted, is pretty agitated. And so actually what I'm going to do is I'm now going to route Ken away from self-serve to a group of agents who are perhaps more experienced, can be far more empathetic with Ken. So I mean this is something of a utopian ideal, I think, is the...
Especially since IVR doesn't understand that when I press that 0 key, like continuously, they don't get it. The IVR doesn't get that I want to talk.
No. But imagine this utopia, Ken, right? Where everyone's predicting your emotional state every day. And as you press that, your customer record says, Ken's angry, right? We're going to push to the nice people. So, but there is a big customer service element, right? How do you start getting the right person? We have this strap line across most of our messaging, which is the right message to the right person at the right time. So how do I ensure, whether it's contact center, self-serve, frankly, even when it's self-serve or a chatbot, right? If we know that as Ken accesses the chatbot, Ken's going to be quite angry, well, do you know what? We can put a different script through the chatbot, or we route into another part. So there's a whole bunch of ways you can use that in customer service.
I think a great example is an airline that I fly frequently. If you are calling on the day of a flight, it starts the prompt with, are you calling about the flight from Honolulu to Denver today? And if that flight's delayed, it says, I'm sure you're calling about that flight from Honolulu to Denver today. Really? So let me connect you with someone who can help answer your questions. And so, and it knows that because, it already, when we talked about loyalty programs, it knows my phone number, it knows my status with the airline, it knows my reservation, and it takes that information, and instead of creating a standard script of, well, you either go to A or you go to B, it instead goes, well, you're going to go to A, sub 1, part 2, subpart 17, and that's how you're going to get response.
And the thing is, Ken, when you think about that, technically, it's actually not that hard to do, right? I mean, just from a logical routing perspective, the technology's there. Most of these companies have the tech. I think it's always a case of, it's almost a mindset shift apart from anything. 9 times out of 10, the tech's there. It's applying it in a very smart way.
Yeah, exactly. And I've worked with another call center for a shipping company in which the same recommendations were made, in which they said, yeah, but that's only going to apply for 1% of our customers. But you also have to remember what that 1% is, as we talked about earlier. Yeah. So that 1% are the ones that are having problems. Already, they couldn't fulfill what they needed online. So they're calling you. Right there, you should already know something is, there's a small percentage that just like human interaction, which probably grew during this time, but there is, there's already a problem if they're getting on the phone to call you. And so it's just knowing those things.
Value payoff, Ken, is huge. Yeah. You look after that, and all of a sudden you've got somebody who is either A, going to leave, or B, says, man, these guys were great. Right. Yeah. And actually your propensity to spend more is, goes through the roof. It's it's very, very impressive. But and then of course as we talked about earlier, CX and insights is obviously a key area, and employee experience is an area that where obviously empathy in employee experience is huge, but typically what you'll see is empathetic training. Okay, so again, it's almost back to that thing around point of interaction, right? How do I train my Starbucks baristas to be empathetic to customers? How do I train contact center agents to be empathetic, or perhaps senior management? I think all that's great, but actually now think about how do I build an employee experience? Because our argument is, well, look, our business is combining behavioral and data science, right? So if I can predict your response to an event, emotional response to an event, actually it doesn't matter whether you're an employee or a customer. So now start thinking about that being applied to build empathetic experiences for employees, and start moving employee surveys from, look, do I like my boss and do I like the biscuits on a Thursday, through to, right, how how do I understand the emotional state of my team? How do I understand who's at risk of leaving? That's a churn modeling.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think the employee and HR piece is going to be huge over the next 2 to 3 years.
And it's two directions too. That's the big thing with employee experience. There's how the employees can empathetically treat customers, especially if they don't know a lot about them, but knowing the types of things and the types of behaviors that customers you can predict just based on, if they're ordering a double shot of espresso, maybe they just need that little extra oomph that day. And then comparing that, also employees are the human stakeholders in this whole situation as well. So management needs to be able to look at that from an empathetic way and not just, oh, well, again, going back to my early operational days, well, there are a number in the system that I have to say,
if we just
we've got to,
that we're going to get more out of them. Yeah. But now imagine a world where you can start saying, right, well, if I know what employee emotions drive which behaviors, and I know from a customer perspective, what behavioral experiences drive what emotions drive which behaviors. Now you have this direct link between employee experience right the way through to strategic outcomes for a company. So, it starts to get fascinating when you start building in that emotional behavior and behavioral science piece to it.
Yeah, it really does. And
yeah.
I think, as we're looking at wrapping up here and starting into the Q&A here, I think when we talk about the results that people can expect from types of programs that you put in place, the engagements that you have, what do they expect to see and when do they expect to see it?
the eternal question. Okay,
I'm a CEO. That's I have to ask.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So strangely, I was asked that by a chief operating officer this morning. Funnily enough, when can I get results? So relatively quickly, and we're not talking about a sort of 2-year payback here, right? We're the kind of process we have a very agile process when we think about how we start to operate this, and we build out a process which allows people to walk before they can run, because I think frankly walking into any organization, I'm saying that as somebody who's bought software in the past, with somebody saying, Jonathan, I know you're at 0 today, but let me just take you right straight to 100 miles an hour in 3 months. It's scary, it's impractical, and so but each of those small steps that we put in place, we try and deliver value. So sort of first step really is what we call a proof of value. And so from that, you now get a very, very detailed piece of insight around, right, what is the linkage between event, moments that matter, emotion, behavior, and financial outcome. So really within a 4-week period, we've probably accelerated that financial linkage piece that frankly, CX pros spend years and hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to get to, so we can very rapidly get to that point. Obviously, if the data is there, we obviously have a pre-discovery component to that, right? So which says, actually, have you got the data? Do we think we can do something for you? Because, in the spirit of empathy, we're certainly not going to, we would far rather say no very, very early, and give some suggestions on how you can move your data set to a point where we can do something with it, than we would just pile in and start doing a project. Then from there we run another probably 6-week component, which really then gives you a complete predictive view of your customer base. So that's models built, it's complete prediction. It's not running real time at this point, but you now have a view where you can now start understanding these cohorts. So probably within let's say a 3 to 4 month period, you can get to the point very rapidly of starting to run a marketing program based on these cohorts that we were talking about earlier. So, and frankly, for this type of program, I think if you can look to get results like, hard financial results within a 3 to 4 month window, that's a very impressive turnaround. So that's where we look to. And then obviously, as you start operationalizing it and you start running these predictions daily or however frequently you need to, yeah, that obviously takes a little bit longer. There are IT projects involved in that. You know, it's you're starting to integrate data sets, you're starting to integrate platforms. So obviously that takes you know, somewhat longer time depending on the company. But you know, I think it's realistic to say within a 3 to 4 month period that, given the right circumstance, you should be able to see some quite significant results.
And what's great is you're taking and breaking down those silos by being able to, again, add one at you don't have to do everything all at once, you know. And you know, what data do I need to start? No, just start with some data, and then we can build in and we can add and we can enhance
and don't get me wrong, this is the very first step, you know, just being able to look at your customer journey and say, look, what emotions are my experiences driving and what behaviors does that drive? Yeah, that piece of analysis on its own is hugely valuable to organizations. You know, so does that give you a dollarized return that you can hang your hat on? No. Will it over a period of time if you went back and did the analysis again? Absolutely. So, and that's you know, as I say, we do have this principle of every step of the journey, as you say, start small, and every step of the journey we deliver value.
Exactly.
So
well, thank you. First of all, Crystal, I'll see if we have any questions. I know it's getting close to glass of wine time there in London.
Yeah. You know, we had it. I mean, that NPS is always a loaded question.
Yes.
I love the NPS question. Can I? Yeah. Go on. Let me have a go.
But I have a simple question. So, Jonathan, what would be your textbook definition of digital empathy?
Oh, see, that's really hard. But my textbook definition would be an organization that has the information available on every customer and every employee to be empathetic at scale. And at scale is the key thing here, right? We can all be empathetic one-to-one. So is that a textbook definition? Probably not. But the key here is understanding the emotions of every customer every day and every employee every day to allow you to put empathetic programs in place. Right. Which will then drive certain outcomes. Okay, as we described, you know, marketing, we're obviously looking at financial outcomes. You know, employee, we're looking at reduction in churn and a latter impact on customer outcomes. But now you've asked for it, I'm actually going to go away and write one because that's.
I was like, honestly, I was like, I've heard of you. Like you and I have hung out twice in the last couple of weeks on calls, and that was really something that was like, you know, if there was something you could like distill it down into a textbook, that would be a real like game changer.
I'm going to do that, and I expect you to read it while you're away for the weekend, Crystal.
I'm going to be honest; it better be digital. That's all I'm saying. Yeah. Better be a digital textbook.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Any other tricky questions you'd like to throw at me, Crystal? Can I go back to the MBS one?
Fun. Though we did, you know, I was on a Clubhouse a couple weeks ago, and there were some market researchers coming after NPS man. They're not about it.
No, well, do you know what? It's like a religion, NPS, right? It's so full disclosure. So I ran the sales and customer success at Satmetrics, who were one of the co-creators of NPS. So I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. And look, it is a great measure because it's simple. And that's the great thing about it, right? You can stick it up to an exec and they say, where are we? It's easy to benchmark. We all understand it. The biggest problem actually with NPS, and I would argue the same with any other metric, right? CSAT, customer effort, you know, every consulting firm, every market research firm has got their own flavor of this is the best metric in the world. And the problem, because somebody said to us, are you going to build out a metric? Actually, I'll tell you, it was Vivek, actually. Are you going to build out an empathy score, right? And I said no. And the reason I said no is because the minute you hang your hat on a score, right, it starts to become all about the score. Right. And the challenge with every CX program and every metric is, actually has nothing to do with the score. There was a bit of a standing joke in the office at Satmetrics where if somebody rang up and as a prospect and said, well, all I want is an NPS score, I just used to say, look, send me 50 grand a month, all right, and I'll just send you a random number. Because that's as much good as measuring NPS and doing nothing with it. And for NPS, replace customer effort, CSAT. If you don't do anything with it, they're all rubbish. I think what NPS has behind it, which is useful, is a methodology. You know, it's got a series of processes that people can think about. And certainly my experience is for those companies who want to invest in a program, it's actually a very good program framework. So when it was built out by the guys, they did a very, very good job in thinking about the methodology. You know, how do you design a program? How do you close the loop? What are the governance structures? You know, what are the measurement frameworks you should be thinking about? But the problem is people look at it as the panacea to all ills. And the reality is, right, it's great for relationships. It's terrible for transactions. Yeah, so I'm a fan of it because it's a simple measure, but it's really divisive. And as you say, and the market researchers hate it primarily because most market research companies have come up with their own metric, which is far more complex. And I'll apologize, Ken, if I'm saying nasty things about the market research.
I'm like that country you referred to earlier. I'm now part of Switzerland, being at Question Pro. Our job is just to help you measure whatever your measure is.
Whatever you want to measure, you can measure it.
We'll measure it. We'll measure all the things.
Yeah.
Jonathan, I think you had an interesting point though about the methodologies, and that kind of comes back to your conversation about engineering, where we've over-engineered things to a point where you're like empathy's been left out of it, but methodologies are still valuable when you can apply that.
Yeah, I mean, massively valuable, Kristen.
Yeah.
Because if you think about it in the context of a CX program, you know, so many people spend their time, you know, chasing survey responses, right? And look, you guys must get this all the time. I need another 2% of my survey responses. But correct me if I'm wrong here. Having run a survey company, I know the conversation. Yeah, and if only I had that smiley face in the corner, you know, that would do it for me. But the reality is, like any form of program, whether it be data or otherwise, unless you understand what you're going to do with it, right? How are you going to govern this? What do you expect somebody to do with the data when you get it? And the same could be applied to, frankly, you know, financial programs, marketing programs, CX programs. And I think in many cases with CX, people don't invest in understanding what is that programmatic design they should think about to drive actionable outcomes. And then how do they close the loop to understand the outcome? So a lot of what we talk about is not dissimilar to MPS methodology, but look, how do you think about a program? How do you design it? Who's going to do what? So yeah, I think methodology, I always think, is key in many change programs.
I love that. Sorry, I'm like taking notes as you're talking so we can do a blog post later. I was like, oh, these are good nuggets. I'm just gonna but I think that's all. I mean, we covered you guys talked about how to cover it in retail. We talked about NPS, engineering versus methodologies. That's great. Thanks so much for your time.
Jonathan, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's much appreciated.
Have a great day, you guys.
Well, take care, everyone. See you later. Bye.